Today's daf is daf Yud Gimel, and we're going to start the new perek from the Mishnah of Hakometz es HaMincha. And here we're getting into the issue of pigul. Pigul means when you had a machshava of chutz lizmano, and the carbon after pigul becomes osur b'achila with a chiv kares. Hakometz es HaMincha lechol shireha olahaktir kumtza lemochar. In this case, at the time of the Kmitza, the Kohen declared that the kometz, which is going to be matir shirayim, then the shirayim of the kometz should be eaten not today or tonight, but the following day, which is chutz lizmano, or he had in mind that the Kmitza itself, the kometz, should be burnt on the Mizbeach tomorrow. Is Moder Rabbi Yossi Bazeh. We'll see later on that Rabbi Yossi has a machlokas with the Chachamim, but in this case, Rabbi Yossi agrees shehu pigul v'chayavin le'akaris. So what is the subject, the case where Rabbi Yossi and the Chacham disagree? And Rabbi Yossi is going to say that there's no pigul. That's the case of lahaktir levonasa lemachar. He has in mind, when he does the Kmitza, that he's going to burn the levona the next day. And Rabbi Yossi says, Potav yein bo kares is no chiyuv kares. So that even though we need the levona, and the haktaras halevona on the Mizbeach will take place today, and he had in mind at the time of his Kmitza that the kometz would be brought, that the levona would be brought on the Mizbeach tomorrow, which is again chutz zmano. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yossi argues that this is not considered pigul. And it seems like the reason for this is Chachamim omrim pigul v'chayim kares, omru lo, ma shina zemin hazevach. Why do you say, Rabbi Yossi, that there's no pigul over here? After all, in a case of a behema, if the shechita was done for the sake of the haktaras haimurim lemachar chutz zmano, then somebody eats from that carbon, he's chayiv kares. Why shouldn't the same din apply to a mincha? Amar lahem, and here we get a little bit of an insight into Rabbi Yossi's shita. Shahazevach domo ubesoro ve'imurov echad ulevona ena min mincha. So in a case of a zevach of a akrovas behema, where at the time that he shechted the animal, the carbon, he had in mind to burn the emurim tomorrow, and he may have had in mind also that the basar should be eaten tomorrow. So that's considered domo ubesaro ve'emura ve'echad. Rabbi Yossi is putting the focus on whether or not we can integrate different parts of the carbon into one entity, which we can do in the case of behema with regard to its dam, its basar, and its emurim. And the dam is there to be matir, the basar for achila, or the emurim for haktorah. So it all comes down to the zrikas hadam. The zrikas hadam is going to allow us to do whatever we have to do with the basar and the emurim, the achilas adam, the achilas mizbeach. But, says Rabbi Yossi, in the case of a carbon mincha, the mincha is one entity, and that includes the kometz after the kmitza, together with the shirayim of the kometz. And then there's another entity called the Levona. And the Torah commands us to put the Levona with the Mincha, but it still remains a separate entity. So first of all, the Gemara is going to ask one question, and then we get back into understanding Rabbi Yossi's distinction between the Levona and the Mincha itself. First, the Gemara wants to know, Lama li lemisna moder Rabbi Yossi bazeh. What was the chiddush here when we learned in the Reisha Hakomitzis HaMincha, and he had a machshavas pigul at the time of the Kmitza? That's not something that Rabbi Yossi would question. Rabbi Yossi's issue is about Levona, but not about, the Shirayim or the Aktar of the Komets. And the Gemara answers it's an issue of symmetry. Mishum de kaboy lemisnei seifa lahaktir al levonosa mochar, and Rabbi Yossi Omer possibly ain't bo kares. Mal de tema time of the Rabbi Yossi mishum de kasavei mefagl chatzi matir, and afilu bereisha kamash malon de baha modeh. So in the Seifa, at the time of the Kmitza, he had in mind that he would be maktir the Levona tomorrow, chutz uzmano. And Rabbi Yossi says that in such a case there's no pigul with a chi of kares. And now we have to figure out why Rabbi Yossi says that there's no pigul in the case of almanas lahaktir levona lemochar. And the Gemara says, Ma'odatema, I could have argued that time of the Rabbi Yossi is because ein mefaglin b'chatzi matir. And the Levona is called a chatzi matir because in order to be matir the aktoras ha shirayim, just one second. So again, let's go over the case. He did the Kmitza, and he had in mind that the Levona would be burnt on his Mizbeach tomorrow, chutz l'zmano. And Rabbi Yossi says that it's not pigul with a chi of kares. And the Gemara invokes now the principle of ein mefaglin b'chatzi matir. I think what the Gemara has in mind is, if I read this correctly, that the Kmitza and the Aktoras Halavona together join hands to create a matir. But if his machshavas pigul was at the time of the Levona, and his machshava was to be maktir the Levona chutz l'zmano, so at the time of the Kmitza, he had in mind that the Levona would be burnt tomorrow. So that would be chatzi matir. Let's see if we understand why it's chatzi matir. Because I know what I want to say here, but I'm just not sure. Just 1 second. Ah, so it means that the pigul has to be chal on both the komets and the levona. Why? Because the komets is a matir, the levona is a matir. The two together create shnei matirim. And if you only had a machshavas pigul regarding the levona, the aktaras halavona, then you didn't have machshavas pigul regarding the komets itself, and therefore you left out chatzi matir. And if that be the case, afilu reisha nami. So let's try to understand what that means. Afilu reisha nami. Let's say if he had a machsheves chutzes mano at the time of the kmitza on the haktoras halavona. So that means the levona will be burnt on the mizbeach tomorrow, chutzes mana, but there was no chutzes mana as far as the komets is concerned. And therefore I would activate the principle of ein pigul lechatzi matir. Because even though his intention was to burn the levona tomorrow, he did not have an intention to burn the komets tomorrow.
So
And
Chati Matir
therefore,
means
even in the
half of it.
case, what?
Chati Matir means half of it is Matir, basically.
Sort of. I mean, actually, chatzi matir is not matir anything because you need the full matir. But the point
Right.
is, there's a shita Reb Meir, we didn't get to it yet, that you could have pigul on a chatzi matir. So if you had a machshavas pigul just on the levona, the aktaras levona, then according to Rabbi Meir, it would effectuate pigul. But now the Gemara is saying that according to Rabbi Yossi, if you didn't have a machshavas pigul of chutzes mano on the komets, which is part of the matir, so you only had a machshavas pigul on the aktaras halavona, which is the other half of the matir, then it would not become pigul. And the Gemara says kamash malon dibaham modeh. That in this case, Rav Yossi is modeh. Why? Because Rav Yossi doesn't have a problem with chatzi matir, and Rashi later on the next Amud is going to quote this Gemara and raise a problem, because it seems now that the Gemara is assuming that everybody agrees that there is pigul on a chatzi matir. But Rabbi Yossi holds that if he had, let's say, a machshavas chutzes mano on the first matir, meaning the komets, and then he had another machshavas chutzes mano on the second matir, meaning at the time of the levona, so again, let's just think. Now the Gemara is saying kamashmalon de baham moda. What's the baham moda? That's what I'm trying to figure out. And the hab moda, I think, is where he had a machshavas pigul during the kmitza, right, to eat the komets lemocher, leachar zman. And that's where Rabbi Yossi holds that Enochinami, there would be pigul. But now, let's say he has a machshava not on the kometz itself, liachar zmana, but on the levona. That's the case where Rav Yossi says that it does not effectuate pigul. And I'm trying to figure out why. Just 1 second. So if during the avoda of the kmitza, he had a machshavas chutzes mano about the kometz, then he effectuates pigul. Again, just on a superficial level, it sounds like the Gemara is saying, according to Rabbi Yossi, that you can't have a machshavas pigul in the kmitza for the haktoras halevona. Why? Because ein pigul lechatzimat. So I was wrong with what I said earlier, that everybody agrees that there is pigul b'chatzimatir. No, it seems that Rabbi Yossi does not accept chatzimatir. So in which case, if he had a machshava, so if he had a machshava b'shas kmitza for the kometz itself to eat it liachar zmanu, that would be a case where Rabbi Yossi concedes that there would be a chiyuv kares, there would be pigul. Because it's not that he's having a machsheves pigul on one matir for another matir. He's having a machsheves pigul on at one matir for that matir itself. So what was his machsheves pigul in the case of komets? It was either lechol shireha or lahaktir kumtza lemocher. So let's just focus on the easier case. Lahaktir kumtza, Rav Yossi's moda that is a chiyuv kares. Why? Because he's not going from one matir to another matir. He's saying the kometz itself, which through the kmitza becomes mutter to burn it on the mizbeach, he had a machshavas pigul of chutzes mano to burn the kometz tomorrow instead of today. Now lahaktir kumtza that we had lechol shirea means he had in mind at the time of the kmitza that he would eat the shirayim tomorrow. But in both cases, Rabbi Yossi is moda because it's not a chatzi matir. He had a machshavas pigul during the kmitza itself, and not for the levono, which is a different matir, but for something related to the kmitza, either the kmitza that's matir the shirayim or the kometz itself that has to be burnt on the mizbeah. Now the Mishnah says, "Lahaktir levonosa lemochar." Rabbi Yossi over posem einbo kares. So at the time of the kmitza, he had a machshav of shelo lishma on the haktoras halavona, and what we said before is the matir of kometz and the matir of haktoras halavona are two separate matirim, and there's no pigul here because ein mefaglim lechatzi matir. Omer Shlokish, Omer Hoyer Rabbi Yossi, ein matir mefagil es hamatir. So again, what's the case now? Right? Let's say he had a kavanas shalol lishma. I'm sorry, not shalol lishma, of chutz zmano at the time of the kmitza for the aktoras hashirayim lemocher. That's the chutz zmano. Or, for example, let's say he had a machshava at the time of the kmitza for the levona. So it seems like, according to Reish Lakish's understanding of Rabbi Yossi, in these cases, there's no pigul. So again, even though he had in mind during the kmitza for the sake of haktar salavona lemachar, but ein matir mefagil as hamatir. So his machshava shalol lishma for levona could not, right during the avoda of kmitza, could not generate pigul. V'chein atav omer b'shnei beziche, parallel case in lechem haponim, shnei beziche levona shel lechem haponim, she'ein matir mefagil es hamatir. So again, he has these two bazichin, and when he was maktir one of these bazichin, he had in mind that the other bazich would be burnt on the mizbeach tomorrow. So Reish Lakish is saying that according to Rabbi Yossi, this would not effectuate pigul because ein matir mefagil es hamatir. Right, there are two matirim. One is one bazich, and the other is the other bazich. So he had in mind a machshavas pigul from one matir to the other, and that doesn't generate pigul. My v'chena to omer. What do you gain by telling me that the same din applies to the shnei, the shnei bazichim? Mao de tema, I would have said, Taima de Rabbi Yossi levona. Mishum delav mina de minchahi, meaning if at the time of the kmitza he had a kavanas chutz luzmano of burning the levona the next day, why doesn't that generate pigul? Mishum delav mina de minchahi. The levona is a different min than the mincha itself, right? The min is flour and the levona is incense. And therefore, since it's two separate minim, therefore in this hava minim, I would say that the kavanas chutz limkoma, the machshava poselis during kmitza, regarding the burning of the levona, that could not generate pigul because it's going from one min to the other. In the case of lechem haponim, where the shnei bazich are from min echad, right? They're both spoonfuls of levona. To mina da hadadi ninu, right? Both the same hadad. Is ema, I would think, mefagle ahadadi. So it means if he had a machshava while he was being maktir one of the two bazichim to be maktir the other bazich tomorrow, in that case, there's no pigul. And why is there no pigul? No. Fakir, we're talking now about min b'mino. Demina da dadininu, right? And therefore, Amar would say that there is pigul. So he has machshov from one bazich to the other bazich, and it's all one min, and therefore it would effectuate pigul. Kamashmal Reish Lakish therefore has to tell us that Rabbi Yossi's opinion will apply even to the case of shnei bazichim, because you can never effectuate pigul from one matir to another. And these two spoonfuls are both being matir. Umi motzis amr taimid Rabbi Yossi bilavona lav mishum de lav mina de minchi. Double negative here. Let's see. You're now analyzing the logic of Rabbi Yossi and our Mishnah, and we're saying that what? That when we go from Kometz to Levona, we're going from one min to the other, and therefore there's no pigul from one min to the other. But in the case of Shnei Bazichim, which is one min, you could have pigul from one bazich to the other. So on that, the Gemara asks, "V'ha ktani seifa amru lo ma'shinsa min hazevach." Why is this different than the zevach? So if the kmitza of the mincha is done with the machshava of haktoras halavona tomorrow, then mashinsa min hazevach. Right? Let's say you shechted an animal korban, and you're going to be burning its eivarim tomorrow. I mean, that's certainly pigul. And the same, therefore, should apply to a mincha. And that's what Rabbi Yossi replies, Hazevach, Domo B'sar V'emurav Echad. Right, we integrate all these parts into one whole, and that's Dam, Basar, and Emurim, is Levona, Eina Min Mincha. But by contrast, the Levona is not made of the same min as the mincha itself. So the levona is a different min, a different kind than the rest of the mincha. And that's where Rabbi Yossi said, don't give me any proofs from zevach to mincha with regard to levona, because mincha and levona is two separate entities. Now, if that be the case, then if Rabbi Yossi says there's no pigul from kmitza to levona because they're two separate entities, then in the case of shnei bazichin, Rabbi Yossi should maintain that there is a machshav of chutz zmano from one bazich to the other bazich. So Gemara answers, "My eino min mincha." What did Rabbi Yossi mean when he said that the levona is not part of the mincha? Eino be'ikuv mincha. In other words, the question is, what has to come first? The kometz, the kmitza, and then the levona, or you could switch it around. So that's what he's saying here. Lav ki hechi dema'akiv lehu kometz l'shirayim. And the word lav means like a negative sign. We don't say that just like you need the shirayim of the kometz to be permitted based on the kmitza, that's because the kamad lav miktar kometz lomas akli shirayim. Right? So you don't have a heter achila shirayim until after you the matir, which is haktaras hakometz. Is hachinami ma'akiv lo lefona? I know, do you read this as a question? Hachinami ma'akiv lo lefona. I guess he's saying it works two ways. the komets needs the levona, and the levona needs the komets. So the matir of the haktaras halevona is the haktaras hakomets. If the komets was not burnt on the mizbeach, then the levona could not be burnt on the mizbeach. Ella, iboy haimak tiberesha, iboy haimak tiberesha. These are two separate entities, two separate matirim, komets and levona. Therefore, if he wants, he can start with haktaras halevona and then do haktaras hakomets, or he could do it the other way around, haktaras hakomets and then the levona. So we see that there are two independent matirim for the shirayim of the mincha. And the shirayim cannot be eaten until you have both the haktaras hakomets and the haktaras halevona. So Rav Yossi says that if you had a machshava during the avoda of the komets for the levona, that doesn't effectuate pigul because they're two separate matirim. And if we get back to the case of Shnei Bazichin, in the case of the Lechem Aponim, we'll apply the same principle. And we'll say that each of these two Bazichin is a separate independent matir for the Lechem Aponim. B'Rabbanan. Why do the Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Yossi? Ki amrinei matir mefagel es hamatir. When do we apply the principle that one matir cannot effectuate pigul for another matir? That's only animili heichadolo ikva b'chad mana. Right? The two matirim were not established as one entity, meaning there was no kiddush and a kli for both of them together. Aval heichad ikva b'chad mana. Like in the case of komets and levona, we are mekadesh both of them in the same kli. Therefore, kechad dami. Right? So the machsheva shelo lishma in one of the two will effectuate, right, for the other one, will effectuate pigul because there's an integration of both komets and levona by virtue of the fact that the kiddush is implemented in the same kli. Omer Rabbi Yanai, likud levona bizar posel. Right, so you have to take off the levona from the komets, and that has to be done by a Kohen, says Rabbi Yanai. My timer. Omer Rabbi Yirmi mishum de holacha nagu ba kasav holacha shelo beregel shma holacha. So it means that one Kohen is going to do the likud of levona, and he's going to give it over to the other Kohen who's standing near the Mizbeach, and he'll be makter it. Now, you and I might have said, based on an earlier sugya in actually in Maseches Vachim, that in such a case, you don't need a Kohen. Because shalo beregel lav shmei holacha. So even though you normally need a Kohen for holacha, and now you have to take the levona and bring it to the mizbeach, but here this is not called a holacha because it was shalo beregel. Right, he's standing right next to the mizbeach, and he puts it right on the mizbeach. Holacha bezar psula. So even though we're saying that according to one man, the Omar, holacha shelo beregel is lav shmei halacha, but we're going to now maintain, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah's interpretation of Rabbi Yanai, that holach shelo beregel shmei halacha. So even though when he's makriv, when he's makariv the lavona to the mizbeach, he still stands in one place. He just extends his hands. Nevertheless, he's considered to be a makabel, a molich, and his status must be that of a Kohen. Halacha b'zar psul. So if a non-Kohen would bring the lavona to the mizbeach, but he doesn't really move his feet, he just passes it on to another Kohen. Nevertheless, halacha b'zar psul. That's called a halacha. Omer Abmari, Afanana Mitanina Zeh Klal. We have a Mishnah that says, "Kol hakometz v'nosem b'kli hamolech v'hamaktir." So we're talking about a machsheves chutz l'zmano of pigul for something that has to be brought on the mizbeach to be burnt, to be consumed by the pyre of the mizbeach. This generates pigul, and the mincha becomes mefugeles. So we have hakometz, hanosi bekli, hamolech, and hamaktir. These are the four avodos of mincha, which correspond to the four avodos of zvachim. Bishlei hakometz, hainu shochem. I understand that what parallels kometz is shchita and zvachim. Molech, nami hainu molech. Okay, so we have molech both in shchitas animals, all zvachim, and in menachos as well. But then it says maktir, hainu zorik. So the haktorah of the what are we talking about now? The haktorah of the komets, or we're talking about the lavona, or both? What are we talking about here? Just one second. Right now, I'm going to assume it's both, either or, either Aktoras HaKometz or Aktoras HaLevona. I don't think it would make any difference. See if he says anything. Ella no bekli, Maika Ovid. Why is that called an avoda? That if he had a machsheves shalom chutzes manu, it would generate pigul. If you want to say that putting it into a kli is similar to Kabbalah, and the reason why he effectuates pigul in Kabbalah is because he's mekadesh the zevach by putting it into a kli. And let's say the same thing with regard to the komets, that the kohen who puts it into the kli, he's doing a critical avoda, and therefore his machshava of pigul would befagel. Gemara asks, Hasam imela hachaka shakil v'rami. So Hasam, in the case of Kabbalah Saddam in Zvachim, he doesn't do anything. But here, in the case of the komets, he takes the komets and he physically with his hands, he puts it into the kli. Ella mishum dekeva de lo sagile de lo ovele. If it's a critical part of the avoda, they can't do without it. And if you don't do the kiddush kli of putting the comments into a kli, the whole mincha, the whole enterprise is invalid. Is avoda chashuvahi. So this is a significant avoda. Al karchach mashvi leki kabbalah. So it's got to be similar to Kabbalah. Because again, if you don't put the comments in the kli to be mekadesh it, then the carbon is possible. Hachanami here too. In the case of asifas ha levona, kaven de lo sagile de lo ovidle. Right, the Torah requires that you have to gather the levona and burn it on the mizbeach. Is avoda chashuvahi. That gives it the chashivas because it's ma'akiv. Al karchach mashvi leiki olacha. And that makes it similar to halacha, which is just like halacha in zvachim is critical. Without it, you can't do. So too, in the case of halacha in Menachos, to bring the levona to the mizbeach, that too is critical. And therefore it has to be done by a kohen, because any avoda that's critical and without which the carbon is not kosher, it's invalid, there we need a kohen. So again, in likut halavona, the carbon, if it was gathered by a non-kohen, is possible. And what says lo? Let's go back to the kiddush kli when the kohen puts the komets into a kli shares, and we said he can effectuate pigul with the machshavas mafageles. That's not because it's critical in the avoda, but li'olam de domi leKabbalah, because we have a parallel structure to Kabbalah. Ude kokasha loch chasam emele v'hacha koshakile. In the case of Kabbalah's dam minat savar in the zvachim, the kohen does nothing; he just stands there and the blood spurts into his kli. Here, in this case, the kohen takes the komets and he has to put it into the kli with his hand. Gemara says that's not an objection. Why? Michti tarti kedushas klihu mali memela mali kashakil v'rami. In other words, we don't have to make this distinction, but rather there's no difference whether the carbon was placed into a kli on its own because the blood spurts into the mizrach that it receives the dam, or someone takes it and places it in that kli, like in our case. And that leads us here to the Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis. Okay, then, so this is where we'll stop for today. I wish you a good week. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shkoya.
Well, too.